We are going to start with a session where we will reflect a little bit on what the discussion in the latter part of yesterday, because we had presentations. We didn't really have a chance to hear from you on any thoughts that you might have about those presentations, and we'll start with that issue. And David will just introduce it very briefly, just to recall matters to what was actually said. We'll then move at 10:30 to look at the ballot paper, which has been distributed on the table. We've worked on it overnight. We've attempted to reflect the discussion of yesterday, the complexity, the logic of the discussion, and we're putting forward this draft ballot paper for your consideration, and we hope we'll be able to agree it by 11 o'clock. We'll then have the pleasure of hearing from Ken Carthy. I'll introduce Ken a bit later on. And then we'll have a final Q&A, and the written questions, of which we have received a number of questions, which were in the box yesterday, and we'll deal with those questions. And if there are any more questions that people want, there's still time to put them into the box. Then we'll have a break for coffee, and when we do the voting, and then we'll come back for the private session, where we've a couple of items to discuss. So just in opening today, as I said yesterday morning, I do try to encourage diversity of voice and expression, and I will be this morning attempting to, if you like, give preference to people who maybe didn't have the chance to speak yesterday. So I would encourage people who want to speak this morning and who didn't have a chance to speak yesterday to do so. So David, could we start with you with just kicking off a brief summary of what we dealt with in the final session yesterday afternoon?
Yes, Tom. The sort of latter part of yesterday afternoon, which is what this is mostly about, was where we moved into the whole question of the administration of elections. So if you remember, it was predominantly Michael Marsh's presentation to you about things like whether Ireland should have an Electoral Commission that takes charge of the electoral process and takes it away from the Department of the Environment and manages it in a sort of more professional way, perhaps. That was sort of an argument I think that Michael expressed quite strongly. There were also points raised about the polling hours. We all can vote between certain hours on one day, a Thursday, and Michael was talking about the possibility that you could extend the polling hours, extend the polling days, perhaps weekend voting, Sunday voting. You'll remember what he had to say about the Sundays. And then questions about postal voting. We're quite unusual in Ireland in having very restricted access to the possibility of voting by post. The vast bulk of us have no option but to turn up and vote in person at the polling stations, so whether postal voting might be considered. So there were sort of things like that about how we might make access to elections easier for citizens. And there was also questions raised about the Electoral Register and how out of date it often is, and it's not an accurate Electoral Register, and maybe a country like ours should try and address that. And generally the theme was on voter turnout and whether there could be more done by the government or other agencies to try and encourage more voters to vote. That was sort of in a nutshell, I think, what he was talking about, and we have between Ken and Jane and myself hopefully some answers to any questions that might come up.
Okay, thanks. That's a very accurate summary, I think. Now, just to a reflection on my part, part of the value of these Q&As is that we're getting ideas out on the table. So when we come to write the report, even though we might not be voting on certain aspects, but we would be, maybe reflecting the content of the discussion in the narrative of the report. So that's part of the context for this discussion that we're now going to have. So basically it's over to you, and as I said, I will be privileging people who didn't get a chance to speak yesterday. Yeah.
Well, I think that the basic part of...
Maybe again, just on our basic discipline of name, please.
Sorry, Patricia Donnelly. The basic part about the elections is the Electoral Register. And if it's not right, well, you need to have everybody's name. And it's not a case that the information about people is not there. You have people's birthdays, births, deaths and marriage register. You have census information. You have household information. So if there was a will there, it shouldn't be a big job to collate all the information and have a proper register.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. Any other comments? Yeah, John, I think.
Hello, John Kenny. Just on the point Patricia was making there, perhaps one way of increasing turnout would be to have people automatically registered for voting, and then they'd have the option to deregister, so then that way people would at least be able to decide to turn out rather than having maybe that barrier that people have to voting. Thanks.
Do you have an idea how people would be automatically registered? What's the practicality of that?
Well, maybe it could be done just via PPS number, whereas, you know, it's on the record where people, once they reach the age of 18, that they'd be, you know, automatically on the register, and then they'd just have the option to deregister if they wanted to.
Okay, thanks, John. John.
John Lardner. Just a question about the MMP system for the successful candidate that gets on the list. How can they be assured of election the next time around? They'll be committed to a national issue. They wouldn't be necessarily working to the extent that they are at the moment in constituent matters. How can they be assured of survival the next time around?
Very good practical question. John, please. Yeah.
John Connolly, Dundrum. Michael Marsh attended our table yesterday and discussed an issue that he had previously discussed at the last meeting, and that was relative to electronic voting. Electronic voting got a bad press, as we all know, and we destroyed the machines, thankfully. But he said there's a difference between paper voting and then scanning the votes and using the media of being able to reproduce a perfect PR system instead of the random or chaotic affair that goes on when you are redistributing votes. So his contention was, and he said he was going to mention it in a speech last night, and it must have slipped his mind, was that his contention was that, okay, electronic voting might have gone by the board, but we can certainly use up-to-date equipment to scan each individual paper that's being voted, and then being able, with the power of mathematics and the computer, to work out a pure PR system. And I imagine that that would be the answer to a lot of our difficulties with this single transferable vote. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We'll have Aileen and then we'll come back to the panel.
Aileen Larkin. I just, over the weekend, I've just kind of realised the importance I feel of establishing an electoral commission, considering we see that it is the responsibility of running elections for the Department of Environment. But when you're reading the letter that they sent us, they really don't, I found that they don't seem to be doing too much. I know someone referred to it yesterday that they were saying for the three of the topics that they're not talking about it, they're not discussing it. But if there's an electoral commission, an independent electoral commission, I think that they will address the issues which we're all talking about, to increase voter turnout. And I think with the establishment of an electoral commission, that should happen. Okay. I feel really strongly about that. That's something that I've kind of decided over the weekend.
Okay, thanks, Aileen. Okay, David, do you want to, and it'll be Jane and maybe Ken might want to comment as well on something like electoral registers, but David.
Yeah, I thought Ken might want to comment on the electoral register thing, but let me pick up a few of the points. So the things were three Johns, but John G, as I put it in my notes here, you were talking about the mixed member proportional system. I mean, the basic, how does a successful candidate who has been elected on the list survive and know that he or she is going to have a chance of coming back in the next time? The glib answer is they have to keep sweet with the party leadership. That's the nature of the party list system, that the party decides how they're going to allocate the candidates, rank the candidates on the list. So if you want to make sure you're going to be high on the list, the last thing you want to do is upset the leadership of your party. because that's going to jeopardize your future. And there are examples of where that's happened, of politicians who, individual legislators who do things that don't please the leadership and they don't come back as a result. So that's the nature of that. So there's a lot more party control of the lists. In terms of the John from Dundrum, was making the point about what Michael Marsh said to your table about electronic voting in the way in which you would get the ballot papers. So we'd fill out the ballot papers in the normal way. We'd use modern technology to scan them in so then the computer could count them. And that's absolutely correct. And there are other single transferable vote systems in Australia that do exactly that. And when you do that, it's exactly what Michael Marsh said to you. You could then introduce a more complex way of counting, so that when you're dealing with surplus votes, the dreaded surplus votes in a single transferable vote, those of you involved with picking the desserts a few weekends ago will know all about that. You can do it in a much more sophisticated way than the way we do it, and you can cut down on the random chance that is in our system. So that would certainly be a rather good reform to do, but we haven't really discussed it in any detail at the sessions here. And I think the only other one, perhaps Ken might want to talk about the Electoral Register. I think that was the only one.
What's your experience in Canada about this?
Well, Canadians were very slow to build a register. Up till 10 years ago, we didn't have a register. And once an election was called, we simply hired 100,000 people, asked them to knock on every door in the country and make a list in 2 weeks of everyone who lived in the country. Well, that system clearly had begun to break down. We find about a quarter of our population moves between elections, and so the real challenge is to produce a register. We now have a national register. It's not as good as it ought to be, but we're really very much beginners at this process. I think the Australians are about the most sophisticated. They have a very sophisticated electoral commission that works very hard at the whole question of electoral registers. But it's quite clear without a good register, you can't have a good vote. I mean, that's where you have to start. And so if there are big challenges with the register here, it seems to me that ought to be a pretty high priority.
So what are the key things the Australians do which get them a good register?
I think they're just on top of it constantly.
Right.
There are all kinds of mechanisms. You've got to, when people move, you've got to find ways to kind of update it. When people move, they typically change their telephone or they change their driver's licenses. There's a range of public ways in which they record address changes or these sorts of things. Those things now automatically feed through computers into the register, so that it's not a matter of individuals doing it. I mean, the real question is who creates the register? Are citizens responsible, as in the United States, or does the state take some kind of responsibility? My experience here is that the register has been a bit sloppy. I was here in 1973, and there was a presidential election that spring, and I discovered to my great surprise I was on the register. I was a visiting Canadian student, and I was living in a house on Strand Road in Dublin, and somehow my name was on the register. I decided it would be inappropriate to vote, and I didn't. But it did suggest to me that there wasn't the kind of care there might have been in making the register.
Thanks, Ken. We'll go back to that table there. Who wants to speak there on that? Terry, please.
Good morning.
Again, name, please.
Terry Ledden.
Yeah.
And well done, Chairman. You've done a very good job. And just want to say that I'm not going to make any comment about the Shannon.
Right. Good.
But just to say, it's the elephant in the room. And I'm saying, with such fine people here, it's most unfortunate that they hadn't an opportunity of discussing the future of the Shannon. But I'm afraid the government decided that you might decide it should be retained. That would be very embarrassing. In relation to an independent electoral commission, absolutely vital. In a small country like Ireland, it's very hard to have an independent commission. The Department of Environment should have no contact whatsoever with the mapping of the constituencies for the commission. It should be done by Trinity or UCD or some other university or some independent body. It conveniently happens at times, and I have no parliamentary privilege, but at one time a chairman of the commission, who's now dead, landed up becoming a judge in a court somewhere else, and it happened to be the person in the department happened to get 4 seats, but he had 3 seats before that. Very convenient, total accident, of course. You couldn't possibly make any allegation about that. Every time mark my word, that the Minister of the Environment is there, the constituencies generally land up pretty good for them. That's fact. Registered electors has been improving. And by the way, the next local election in 2014, May, there'll be about a window of opportunity, about a week, for people who have not been registered to register. That's a great help. And I was interested in Jerry Adams' comments. Jerry's very good down there. Great man to gather votes. Sinn Féin is like Fianna Fáil. They were great men to get votes out early and often. Say no more. Know all about it. And well done. You followed in the footpaths of the masters. and I know what I mean. By the way, in Longford, there was a house with 50 people registered in the last local election, which is very convenient. And really, basically, it's very hard to get the really perfect list, but it's as good as we can do at the moment. I think there's some tweaking there that could happen, and I think this is a great forum, by the way. It's great to see people so involved in this whole issue, and I'm just delighted to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry. Okay. Katrina, yeah, okay.
I just want to make a brief point in relation to how we get Ken's point about taking the electoral register very seriously at all different levels of government. And we do have an electoral commission in the north, and it's certainly not the be-all and the end-all. There's lots of difficulties, and it's far too difficult to get on it. We have to make it as easy as possible to get on it, but obviously monitoring it and constantly working on it. But one of the problems, I think, and we saw the response from the department yesterday, which I think is shocking. I think just a careless attitude. You're asking about how young people get on register, and we got the response that we got. So maybe what we need to do is look at our constitution, see how we put the right to vote, how strongly we put it into the constitution, so then regardless of what mechanisms we bring forward, it's everyone's job. Obviously, Electoral Commission leading it if that's what we choose, but that it's every government department's job to play their part of the role. Thank you.
Back there, is that Andrew?
Thanks, Chairman. Two brief comments, if I may. Just in terms of the register, it strikes me that with property taxes and household charges and so on, for better or not, the resources that are now available in terms of the information and the quality of information that now resides within various agents of the state must be now better than ever. Now, whether that can be accessed or whether we use, obviously, is another issue. But in terms of people moving around and who lives where, the quality of information must be improving all the time. And the other brief point to make is that just in terms of electronic voting and electronic counting, I think it's extraordinary that in a situation where we're depending on high technology businesses, foreign direct investment, that we can't get our act together to use the electronics to vote. But with our Googles and our eBays and our Facebooks and so on, that we still revert to pencil and paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the floor? Yeah, Fiach, please.
Thank you, Fiach Machanil. First of all, I thoroughly enjoyed the last 2 weekends on a very technical but also ultimately very rewarding theme and topic, particularly because it does get to the core of some of our challenges and also challenges some of our perceptions or indeed some of our prejudices around numbers and so forth. But I think, Chairman, a couple of things, and I have a couple of comments. One, I would agree with a lot of the comments around what I would call the mean-spiritedness response of the Department of the Environment. And I think it shows, I would call, a mild disregard to you, Chairman, and to the Convention in the way that it didn't engage, the Department didn't engage in a conversation or a dialogue with the Convention. So, I want to put on the record that certainly, from my point of view, I'm kind of embarrassed by their response. It shows a lack of generosity and a lack of dialogue to the citizen members of this convention. Secondly, on a small point about the register, just two anecdotes. One is I happen to speak Gaeilge at home and Learm Gaeilge Gabaile agus tá mé Mahoney in Emmett Road agus tá mé Clara in Emmett Road ach Neil Emmett Road mar chuite inche cór. In other words, Emmett Road as a street is not recognised in Irish, and I have to go to a different part. Now, my daughter registered under Emmett Road in English, and so she goes to another part. So just on a purely administrative level, they're not getting that right either. And again, that's something that, and I'm sure there are a lot of other anomalies of that. Secondly, one of the suggestions that came from the previous table that I was involved in last week is that there's always, and again, there's always a rush by young people at the age of 18. And they have no issue regarding the complicated procedure in filling in several forms to get their Garda ID when they're 18 to continue their social journeys. And I would think in the short term that perhaps, without anyway encouraging what they might be doing with their Garda ID, that actually it is possible to encourage people to fill in complicated forms if there's an incentive, and if one can combine several link across, and the Garda ID it could be one possible way for young people to register pretty quickly. Certainly, it was one of the conditions of in our household that they would vote and get the Garda ID at the same time. So finally, just in terms of the weekend, and again, I'd like this perhaps, Chairman, when you're reporting to government on this weekend, that I suppose one of the issues that certainly that was raised in our table is that you cannot look at electoral reform in isolation. Yeah. And I think it would be certainly would do a disservice to, and there was a multiple of views here. I'm not saying we were all in agreement, but I think the strong message from our table would be that it can't be done in isolation, that there's issues around serious local government reform, issues around civic education, issues around better delivery of service, and of course the Electoral Commission. So when we are voting for our own views around electoral change, we are considering and understanding that it's one part of an overall scheme, an overall context. And I think it would benefit the convention, perhaps, Chairman, if you would convey that to government, that we're not just here to use Professor Farrell's comment, being nerdy around the particular, and that's very important that we become nerdy, and we have become nerds when it comes to electoral systems now, but actually we are deeply concerned and deeply aware of the overall political context around political participation, and those other issues should be taken into account when you convey this to the government.
Thank you very much for your very thoughtful contribution. And, you know, I did attempt in my opening yesterday morning actually to try to situate the discussion of electoral reform in a much wider context, very much along the lines that you've suggested, and we will very definitely attempt to reflect that in the report. And that's again harkening back to say, you know, this is part of the value of these discussions, that we can surface matters which we will reflect in the report over and above just giving the results of our deliberations as expressed in the ballot, which I think brings us very nicely. And sorry, there's one more question there, Robert, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Sorry. Robert Dowds. One practical point and one suggestion. Practical point. In addition to improving the electoral register, I think the single biggest thing, from my experience as a practicing politician, which would improve the voting turnout, would be provision of postal votes, because I'd say more people come to me, say at election time, saying, well, I'm sorry, I won't be able to vote because I'll be on holiday or away for some reason, and therefore I can't. So I think that a better postal ballot situation would improve that rate. And in relation to the reply we got from the Department of the Environment, I thoroughly agree with the critical comments that have been made about it, and I really think that the Convention should write back and ask for a more adequate response, because what they have said is not adequate, and I think it is probably the feeling of the Convention generally that it was not adequate, and that we would like a further response, and that we keep going at them until they give us a decent response. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. Okay, I think we should move now to the, if you like, the business end of our morning, which is the ballot paper.